What if the most dangerous secret Marilyn Monroe ever kept had nothing to do with the President of the United States? What if the real scandal, the one worth killing for, was buried in a government file stamped top secret? The story you've been told is a carefully constructed fantasy, a ghost story written by the men who haunted her. They painted her as a fragile, tragic victim of Hollywood, but they were hiding a much darker truth. Marilyn Monroe was not a victim. She was a threat. The world of 1955 was a place of pristine surfaces and festering secrets. It was the age of American supremacy, of gleaming chrome Cadillacs cruising down manicured suburban streets, of television sets flickering with the wholesome morality of Leave It to Beaver. In this carefully polished diorama of prosperity, Hollywood was the crown jewel, and Marilyn Monroe was the diamond set at its very center. She was more than a star. She was a national obsession, an incandescent fantasy of peroxide and silk projected onto the silver screen. To the public, she was the ultimate symbol of American desire, playful, beautiful, and blissfully unaware. She was a caricature of innocence, a walking, talking embodiment of everything pure and worth protecting from the creeping shadows of the Cold War. But in another part of America, in the gray, sterile corridors of Washington, D.C., a different kind of obsession was taking hold. J. Edgar Hoover, the immutable director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, did not see a national treasure when he looked at Marilyn Monroe. He saw a security risk. Hoover's America was a battleground, a nation besieged by an invisible enemy, a red menace that he believed lurked not just in Moscow, but in the lecture halls of universities, the union meetings of factory workers, and most insidiously, in the decadent, influential heart of Hollywood. He saw subversion in every shadow, conspiracy in every whisper. His agents were not just chasing criminals. They were hunting ideologies. They were building a secret archive on the nation's own citizens, a vast, dark library of wiretaps, informants, and confidential files. And Marilyn was about to become its most notorious entry. The official story begins quietly. A single memorandum, dated 1955. An anonymous letter, sent to the columnist Walter Winchell and forwarded to the Bureau, claimed that Marilyn's new production company was full of reds and was being financed by communist money. It was a flimsy piece of gossip, the kind of poison pen letter that littered the desks of powerful people. In the ordinary course of things, it would have been dismissed, filed away, and forgotten. But nothing about Hoover's FBI was ordinary. For him, the letter was not an accusation to be investigated. It was a premise to be proven. And so, it began. A file was opened. A number was assigned. 100-390001. From that moment on, Norma Jean Mortensen, known to the world as Marilyn Monroe, ceased to be just a person. In the cold, clinical language of the Bureau, she became a subject, a person of interest, a case file to be filled with rumors, photographs, and the whispered reports of faceless informants. This is our first rehook. The story most biographers tell is that the FBI's interest in Marilyn was fleeting, a minor consequence of her marriage to the controversial playwright Arthur Miller. They present the file as a bureaucratic footnote, a thin collection of trivialities. But when you look closer, when you truly examine the declassified documents, a terrifying reality emerges. Key pages are missing. Entire sections, sometimes spanning years, are withheld under the justification of national security. Events that should be documented in detail are glossed over with single, cryptic sentences. The file is not a complete record. It's a curated crime scene, with the most damning evidence carefully removed. The real story begins not with a whisper, but with a vow. In 1956, Marilyn Monroe did something that Hollywood, the press, and the United States government considered an act of career suicide. She married Arthur Miller. Miller was a titan of the American stage, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Death of a Salesman, a celebrated intellectual. But in the eyes of Hoover's America, he was something else entirely. He was a suspected communist. Miller had been a vocal critic of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, the congressional witch hunt dedicated to purging supposed communists from public life. He had signed petitions, attended meetings, and lent his name to causes the government deemed subversive. His past was a roadmap of associations that, to men like Hoover, amounted to treason. He was a marked man. And by marrying him, Marilyn wasn't just choosing a husband, she was choosing a side. The studio, 20th Century Fox, was apoplectic. They begged her to call it off. They warned her that marrying a man who was about to be dragged before Congress would destroy her. The press portrayed her as a naive, love-struck girl, being manipulated by a sinister intellectual. They couldn't comprehend that her decision was not born of ignorance, but of fierce, defiant loyalty. She saw the persecution of her fiancé for what it was, a grotesque perversion of American values, and she refused to abandon him. Weeks after their wedding, the government made its move. Arthur Miller was subpoenaed to testify before HUAC. The committee didn't just want a confession. They wanted names. They wanted him to betray his friends, to name every writer, actor, and director he had ever seen at a meeting, to become an informant against his own community. It was a ritual of public degradation, and refusal meant prison time, fines, and professional ruin. Everyone expected Marilyn to keep her distance, to issue a quiet statement from a film set in London, to protect her own career. Instead, she flew back to Washington and walked into the lion's den with him. She sat in the gallery, in full view of the cameras and the congressman, a silent, luminous act of rebellion. Her presence was a calculated bombshell. It transformed a political hearing into a global media event. She was using her fame, the very thing the system had given her, as a shield for its designated enemy. To the committee, it was an unforgivable act of defiance. To J. Edgar Hoover, it was confirmation. She was no longer just an associate of a subversive. She had become one. Miller, with Marilyn watching, refused to name names. He was convicted of contempt of Congress, his passport was revoked, and he was blacklisted. But in the FBI's ledgers, a new, more urgent entry was being made. The investigation into Arthur Miller was now inextricably linked with the surveillance of his wife. Agents began meticulously documenting her life, her phone calls, her appointments, her correspondence. They interviewed her friends, her staff, her colleagues, searching for any sign of ideological contamination. This is the second rehook. The Bureau wasn't just watching her because of Miller. They were using Miller as the pretext to justify an investigation that would soon spiral far beyond him. They saw her as a powerful cultural influencer, a woman with a direct line to the hearts and minds of millions of Americans. If she could be swayed, if her sympathies lay with the wrong people, she represented a threat more potent than any political radical. An icon could not be allowed to have an ideology. Her circle of friends became a gallery of suspects. She was close with the actor and singer Yves Montand, a man with known leftist sympathies in his native France. She was photographed with Simone Signoret, another French intellectual and activist. She vacationed with the poet Norman Rostand, a man whose own FBI file was thick with accusations of communist ties. To the world, these were friendships. To the Bureau, they were cells of a conspiracy. They were building a case, piece by painstaking piece, painting a portrait of a woman who was not the airheaded sex symbol from her films, but a thoughtful, compassionate individual drawn to artists and thinkers who challenged the status quo. Her sin was not espionage, it was empathy. The investigation reached a fever pitch in 1962. By now, her marriage to Miller was over, but the FBI's scrutiny had only intensified. It had developed its own momentum. That year, she planned a trip to Mexico. On the surface, it was a shopping trip, a chance to buy furniture for her new home in Brentwood. She traveled with her publicist, Pat Newcomb, and her interior designer. It looked like a perfectly normal celebrity getaway. But FBI informants in Mexico City told a different story. The Bureau's file on the trip reads like a spy novel. It details her meetings, her movements, her conversations. They reported that her trip was not about furniture. It was about politics. According to their sources, she was meeting with a group of prominent American leftists who were living in exile in Mexico, individuals who had fled the United States during the peak of the McCarthy-era witch hunts. And at the center of this circle was one man in particular, Frederick Vanderbilt Field. Field was not some minor figure. He was the heir to the Vanderbilt fortune, a man who had renounced his immense wealth and privilege to become a devoted, high-ranking member of the American Communist Party. He had been jailed during the 1950s for his beliefs, and had eventually expatriated to Mexico. He was, in the FBI's view, one of the most dangerous communist figures in the Western Hemisphere. The informant's report is chillingly specific. It claims Marilyn spent hours at Field's home. It alleges that she spoke openly of her admiration for their political stance and her disgust with the political climate in America. The file quotes a source who claimed Marilyn was very positive and progressive in her views, and that she had become infatuated with the egalitarian spirit of communism. This is the narrative Hoover was building. The naive movie star, corrupted first by her husband, was now actively seeking out and embracing the nation's most committed enemies. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was that it was in the file. It was an official fact, a piece of intelligence that could be weaponized at any moment. The trip to Mexico was no longer a vacation. It was an act of fraternization with the enemy. And this brings us to our third rehook, a detail that is almost always overlooked. The Mexico trip occurred in late February of 1962. Just 2 months later, in April, Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered the installation of a wiretap on the home of one of his own Justice Department aides, a man he suspected of leaking information. That much is public record, but newly declassified documents reveal the wiretap had a secondary, clandestine purpose. The aide was a frequent associate of Marilyn Monroe. The surveillance wasn't just about him, it was about her. The FBI had now crossed a critical threshold. Passive surveillance through informants and field agents had escalated to active, electronic eavesdropping. They were listening to her private conversations. This wasn't just about her political leanings anymore. The game had changed. Because by 1962, Marilyn Monroe was entangled with men far more powerful and far more dangerous than Arthur Miller or a few exiled communists. She was involved with the President of the United States and his brother. The story of Marilyn and the Kennedys is usually told as a Hollywood melodrama, a tale of secret love, glamour, and heartbreak. It's the story of the breathy, scandalous rendition of Happy Birthday at Madison Square Garden, of whispered trysts and quiet exits from the White House, but seen through the cold, paranoid lens of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. The affair was something else entirely. It was a catastrophic failure of national security. Hoover loathed the Kennedys. He viewed them as arrogant, corrupt usurpers. He had spent decades building his own fiefdom within the government, and he saw the charismatic brothers as a threat to his power. He maintained his infamous secret files on politicians for exactly this kind of situation, to be used as leverage, as insurance. And Marilyn Monroe had just handed him the ultimate weapon. The President of the United States was intimately involved with a woman who was, according to the FBI's own voluminous files, a communist sympathizer who was actively meeting with known enemies of the state. It was a perfect storm of sex, celebrity, and subversion. In Hoover's mind, Marilyn was no longer just a security risk. She was a potential conduit. What state secrets was the president telling his lover in moments of intimacy? What classified information was being discussed on phone lines that the Bureau now knew she used to communicate with radicals? She had become the nexus point of all of Hoover's obsessions. The moral corruption of the Kennedys, the subversive influence of Hollywood, and the insidious threat of communism, all converged on this one singular woman. The surveillance became suffocating. Agents didn't just listen to her calls. They documented them in painstaking detail. Her home, a place she had bought as her first real sanctuary, was no longer safe. It was a fishbowl. And this is where the official story breaks down completely, leading to our fourth rehook. The FBI, and later apologists for the official narrative of her death, have always maintained that the surveillance was routine, that the wiretaps were indirect. They claim she was never the primary target. But a deathbed confession from a former FBI wiretap specialist tells a different, horrifying story. He claimed that in the final months of her life, a special, off-the-books unit was tasked with a singular objective: bugging Marilyn Monroe's house directly. Not just her phone, but her bedroom, her living room. They used sophisticated listening devices, drilling through walls from neighboring properties, planting bugs during staged phone repairs. They were capturing everything: her arguments, her fears, her most private and vulnerable moments. She knew she was being watched. Her friends from that period all reported the same thing. She had become deeply paranoid. She would whisper in public, convinced the restaurant tables were bugged. She would unplug her phones, convinced someone was listening. She would tell friends, "I know they're watching me." Everyone dismissed it as the neurotic fantasy of a troubled star. They were wrong. It wasn't paranoia. It was the terrifying, lonely truth. The Bureau wasn't just collecting intelligence on a potential security threat anymore. They were gathering blackmail. They were recording the intimate details of her affairs with both John and Robert Kennedy. They were documenting the dangerous pillow talk, the political secrets she was now privy to, the promises the brothers made to her and then broke. The file wasn't about communism now. It was about pure, unadulterated power. It was Hoover's leverage against the White House. And according to the whistleblower's account, they recorded something explosive in the final week of August 1962. It was a furious, tearful phone call between Marilyn and Robert Kennedy. She was threatening to hold a press conference to reveal everything, not just the affairs, but what she had learned from them, about the government's secret plans, about backroom political deals, about the Kennedys, connections to organized crime figures like Sam Giancana, men the FBI was also investigating. She had become more than a liability. She had become a ticking bomb, and the men in power knew they had to disarm her. What the FBI wiretaps captured next has been the subject of rumor and speculation for decades. The official tapes, of course, have either been destroyed or are locked in a vault so deep they will never see the light of day. But the agent who was there, the man who listened to her final hours, claimed the last conversations she had weren't with doctors or friends. They were with men who came to her house late that night, men whose voices he recognized. The final entry in the secret surveillance log, before the tape abruptly cuts out, did not describe a suicide. It described an altercation. It described a struggle. It described a woman screaming a single name, over and over again, a name that was not in any police report. The name was not Bobby. It was not Jack. The name the FBI agent heard her scream just before the line went dead was Ralph. Who was Ralph? For 60 years, this question has been the ghost in the machine of the official story. Ralph was Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn Monroe's personal psychiatrist, the man who was supposed to be saving her from her demons. He was also the man who discovered her body, the man who called her doctor before he called the police, the man whose timeline of that fateful night changes with every telling. On the surface, Greenson was her anchor in the storm of her life. But dig a little deeper, and the relationship looks less like therapy and more like a hostile takeover of her very soul. Was he a healer, or was he a handler? Greenson was introduced to Marilyn through Frank Sinatra, a man who acted as a social bridge between Hollywood and the nexus of political and criminal power. Greenson wasn't just any Beverly Hills shrink. He became the gatekeeper to Marilyn Monroe. In her final year, if you wanted to see her, you went through him. He dictated her schedule. He vetted her friends. He even had her hire a housekeeper, a woman named Eunice Murray, who many now believe was not a maid but a minder, there to report Marilyn's every move back to the good doctor. His therapeutic method was radical and deeply controversial. He called it reparenting. He was trying to dismantle her identity and rebuild her in an image he could control. He isolated her, fostering a total dependency that blurred every ethical line imaginable. But here is the crucial question. Was he doing this for her benefit, or for someone else's? Was his therapy a tool to control a volatile asset for the most powerful men in the country? Think about it. The Kennedys have a problem. The biggest movie star in the world knows their secrets and is becoming unstable. How do you control her? You don't send a government agent. You send a doctor. Someone she'll trust. Someone who can feed her pills, analyze her moods, and report back on whether the situation is stable or about to explode. Greenson was the perfect cutout. This brings us back to the horror of that final night. Greenson's official story is a shambles of contradictions. He claimed he rushed to the house after a worrying phone call, saw her through the window, unresponsive, and broke the glass to get in. But the very first police officer to arrive, Sergeant Jack Clemens, stated in his report that the window was broken from the inside. Why would Greenson lie about something so fundamental? The lies don't stop there. The time he arrived, the time he called for help, the state he found her in, all shifted depending on who was asking. But the most damning piece of physical evidence is one that has been deliberately ignored for decades: the autopsy. The coroner, Drive Thomas Noguchi, found her body contained a massive, lethal dose of nambutyl and chloral hydrate, enough to kill 3 people. Yet, he found absolutely no pill residue in her stomach. She didn't swallow them. Dr. Noguchi famously said that to get that level of saturation in the liver, without any trace in the stomach, the drugs would have had to have been administered in another way. One way, he suggested, was an injection. And there was, in fact, a single, unexplained bruise on her body. But another, far more insidious method would leave no mark at all. It was a method of administering sedatives that was common in psychiatric institutions at the time. A method Drive Greenson was known to favor with difficult patients, a drugged enema. Suddenly, the picture of that night changes from a sad suicide to a clinical, horrifying procedure. A struggle, a woman held down, a fatal dose administered by the very man she trusted with her life. The scream of his name, Ralph, captured by the FBI wiretap, wasn't a plea. It was an accusation. So what was the motive? Was Greenson just a hired gun, an assassin in a doctor's coat, carrying out an order from the White House? Perhaps. But there is a darker, more personal theory. Greenson's reparenting experiment was failing. Marilyn was starting to pull away. She had secretly reconciled with her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, a man who despised her Hollywood circle, especially the Kennedys and Sinatra's crew. She was planning to fire Greenson. And then she planned the press conference, the one where she would expose everything. For the Kennedys, This was a political catastrophe. For Dr. Ralph Greenson, it was something far worse. It was the public destruction of his entire professional life. His patient, his creation, was about to go on the world stage and reveal the intimate details of his bizarre, controlling, and unethical methods. He wouldn't just be disgraced, he'd be ruined. She wasn't just a threat to the president anymore, she was a threat to him. The FBI wiretap didn't just record a political assassination. It recorded a crime of passion, a desperate act of psychological self-preservation that conveniently solved a massive national security problem for J. Edgar Hoover and the Kennedy brothers. And what did the FBI do with this explosive tape? They buried it. Why? Because a live Marilyn Monroe threatening a press conference was a problem, but a dead Marilyn Monroe, whose murder could be pinned on the Kennedys at any moment Hoover chose, was the perfect blackmail. The file was complete. The leverage was absolute. The official cause of death was cemented as probable suicide. The LAPD investigation was quietly and efficiently shut down by forces from above. Key witnesses were intimidated. Evidence, like Marilyn's personal diary, vanished from the police locker. Dr. Greenson went back to his practice. A tragic figure in a Hollywood drama. Never a suspect. He maintained his silence until the day he died. But there was one other person in that house on the night of August 4th. Someone who saw everything. Someone whose story has been systematically dismissed, ridiculed, and ignored for over half a century. The housekeeper, Eunice Murray. She was Greenson's woman on the inside. She was the first person he spoke to. She was the one who changed the bed sheets before the police arrived. Her official statements were a mess of contradictions, even more so than Greenson's. But it's what she did after the investigation was closed that raises the most terrifying questions. Just days after Marilyn's death, Eunice Murray, a woman who lived on a housekeeper's salary, boarded a flight to Europe with a brand new set of luggage and a briefcase reportedly filled with $20,000 in cash. Where did that money come from? And what was she running from? Decades later, on a forgotten audio tape, she would accidentally let the truth slip, a single sentence that blows the entire official narrative to pieces and reveals the final, horrifying moments in that locked bedroom. The year was 1985. The interviewer was Anthony Summers, a tenacious journalist who refused to let the official story die. He was speaking with an elderly Eunice Murray for a BBC documentary. For hours she stuck to her crumbling script, but then, exhausted and cornered by her own contradictions, she let her guard down. The camera was off, but the audio was still rolling. Summers asked her, plainly, about the night of the murder. Annoyed, flustered, Eunice snapped back, "Why are you probing me?" And then, forgetting who she was talking to, forgetting the decades of lies, she uttered the sentence, a casual, exasperated admission that reframed everything. Speaking of Robert Kennedy's presence that night, she said, "Well, it was all right. Why at her age is she still naked in bed with a young man?" Suddenly, the last pieces click into place. It wasn't just Greenson. The Attorney General of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy, was in that room. He had come to retrieve her little red diary, the one that detailed her affairs with both him and his brother. An argument erupted. Marilyn, betrayed and furious, threatened to expose them. Dr. Greenson wasn't called to calm a patient. He was called to solve a problem. With Eunice Murray standing guard at the door, the two men subdued her. It was no suicide. It was a politically sanctioned murder, carried out by a doctor to save his own career, and orchestrated to protect the most powerful family in America. The broken window, the changing timelines, was all a frantic, clumsy cover-up to give the Attorney General time to vanish into the night. Marilyn Monroe wasn't a fragile starlet who couldn't handle the pressure. She was a woman who knew too much, a fighter who was silenced at the exact moment she decided to speak her truth. Her death wasn't a tragedy, it was an execution. Her legacy was hijacked, her complexities flattened into a cautionary tale, all to bury the sins of powerful men. They killed her, and then they killed the memory of who she truly was. The secrets of the powerful are often hidden in plain sight, buried under official reports and comfortable lies. Marilyn's story is not the only one. Countless truths have been silenced, countless lives redefined to protect the guilty. But the boulevards of history have long memories, and the echoes of the truth can still be heard, if you know how to listen. To uncover more of the stories they tried to bury, and to give voice to those who were silenced, subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe. The truth is waiting to be found.